an update to the functional projection of the character David versus the devil worshippers. The assumption, by definition, has an intertwined valuation of everything that David would have traded, which had to have been superimposed in the past, the present, and the future into a single consolidated contract schedule, which, having been normalized in its offers as the basic market price before subversion, is essential to understand as an intertwined, specific, complete unit. They, having been able to have manipulated the trades, exchanged the difference between that and the communists from the wizards that we currently suffer, separates the economy into the version where they stand a chance against the Americans. So the original one, let's say by definition you have the 800 billion buying the black community's debts from being terrorized, and then you have the function of those debts being purchased in exchange for the blueprints of the 800 billion being realized into the Confederate state businesses, which facilitates their ability to capture the Confederacy, which is an essential function of being able to get the payment of the debt settled, as they owe to uh, those targeted individuals the value of their rights under law, and those having been violated have to be compensated for, and thus whatever they were able to prove they were a victim of that was unpaid because of the communist wizards being able to block them from justice, from a remedy, by their secret magic, generates the obligation of the courts to order the remedy and to see it realized to its full maturity. At which point you have these values which are actively exchanged. So the assumption is that the highest market before David was born was based upon the Cold War, which was the ability to gain a treaty with the former Soviet Union. And the value of that is everyone else had already been focusing on the investment of the conflict, of getting funding for the war itself, either by it being a Cold War or it turning into a hot war. So by definition, the unused aspect of the market has already been established as diplomacy. So the non-diplomatic answer is already highly saturated, which means it's the most expensive to enter, and diplomatic relationships are the easiest to deal with, and thus the cheapest, and thus the most desirable market. At which point the investment into these functions asserts the long-standing obstructed markets from the Legend of David brokerage company, which generates the long-standing abuses because they, having to be told about the advantages of the free market, um, had that censored from them. So if they had been told about it and they would have traded around it, then they would have generated the profits for that market, and thus they had to not be told so that they would not make those investments, so that the money could be spent in alternative ways by those trying to manipulate them as white nationalist wizard communists, allowing for the extortion of those targeted communities to be the advantage or satisfaction of the racists who are trying to destroy them by the social engineering, by creating a self-destructive culture as an objective, whether or not it was realized. At which point you have the full market, which does not need David to receive or maintain lots of money, at which point it would actively be amplified for the brokerage leveraging all excess money would be amplifying the rest of the market inside the network. before David is born because they don't have the body to take care of, and thus the only expense is leveraging it to their advantage. And thus their interest is by definition amplifying their own security markets. At which point you have the advancements and spreading of those markets, and for the prospects of the treaties with the other nations available, which are at least going to be 15. At which point you have the assertion that the former Soviet Union breaking up into 15 parts would allow a 1-to-1 ratio at a minimum. At which point you have the advancements of these agreements of those who actually need to have made the treaties, such as those who have collected David from the courts when he was an infant, who asserted that he was, according to the contract schedule they're obstructing in the military intelligence, would have been the savior of Europe. So it's at least going to include Europe. And it's at least going to include Israel, which has been asserted as a target for eradication by the white nationalists taking over the United States government. At which point you have those countries which need to, at a minimum, have had the agreement by definition. So the United States and Europe, at least, before any other expansions or projects could be arranged. At which point their consulates and embassies would have been generated for the advancement of those treaties in the economic arrangements. So the economic treaties, having established the insurance market in those areas with their nation, between their nation and David's nation as a kingdom, would have actively been generating its stability for a long time, saving those resources, which leveraged David's position to amplify those markets so that they have the most potential successes in protecting the treaty holding nation's economy. As those advances in the treaties only have the consulates and the embassies to invest into uh, before the staff, uh, generating the only actual cost, which is just the cost of doing business with the nation, at which point the rest of it is just amplifying the market. So the overlapping functions in order to consolidate the satisfaction of this treaty's objectives materializes the real capitalist market in the world, hated by the white nationalists. At which point this would have culminated into David being born in Springfield, having been bred as an indigo child from their records in the secret courts, which they were hyper focused on his sexuality as hyper masculine from birth, having been determined by the breeding program to be the only one of his siblings who've qualified as the hyper masculine indigo child, justifying their abuses against him as he is the realization of the thing that they were looking for, generating their retaliation when they abandon the quest of cooperation or necessary force in order to win. When they abandon necessary force in order to win in favor of satisfying their arbitrary objectives in the market for communism, their successes went exponentially down, and the destructions and dismantlements of the market went exponentially down, such as the Republicans' references to the side effects of democratic policies inside the United States jurisdictions. These would actively, by comparison, demonstrate the injury to the market, which are normal to the Confederacy, which is actively defaming the Confederates by virtue of the wizard communists artificially reducing the success of those policies by subversion and by rewriting them to fail. At which point, you understand that gaining the treaty with the former Soviet Union is the most desirable objective, and thus stabilizing in its economy is the assumption. And thus you have the investment into the assertion that they're going to endure famine at some point of the treaty, and they're going to have a social breakdown and a government breakdown, and they're probably going to break down in the investment from the military intelligence oversight function, actively amplifies the ability to project the insurance to stabilize the inevitable breaking of the former Soviet Union into the 15 parts. At which point, you actively have the Russian objective to spread out the insurance as evenly as possible as to keep the cohesion of them, despite the fact that they're fracturing into a neutral alliance. And thus, David, as having a treaty with them, guaranteeing the protection of the neutrality, prevents NATO from expanding into the former Soviet Union territories, according to the thing that the Russians actively had been promoting. And so I have to take their word for it. That's what they would have sent to David as a treaty for the brokerage by definition. So if they keep it to the Russian Federation instead of spreading it out evenly, then by definition there was less cohesion, and they can't really argue that NATO shouldn't expand into them because they're not protecting them. So by definition they have to spread it equally, and thus the spread guarantees those functions. Now, their assumption that the Russian Federation wanted to trade David's consulate and embassies to be in those locations, such as in Siberia, determines the exponential weakness of the location, which requires it to become an airfield. By definition, any economic trade requires the active distribution of resources, requires the ability to transfer it. So until you can build an air force, you don't really have huge success. You're limited merely to the railroads and to what you're able to drive, which is limited by weather. At which point you have the guaranteed long-term investment into air security as the primary objective of the Slavic coalition, which is the former Soviet Union. So the markets from David's brokerage network actively encourage from David's leverage to accelerate the potential of having access to that market, which means everyone who has an account in this network is actively given bonuses and accelerations to attract them to making those investments and redistributing those informations while maintaining their security. Bringing their investment down to their bare bones means their necessary precautions have to be maintained. They can't really put too much at risk. They can reduce how much they eat, but they can't reduce how much security they have. So their vulnerability would actively attract a retaliation by the lynch mobs. So by definition, bare bones is just what they're able to tolerate while on the run. So they're actively saving for excess storages with the security. And then if the trade ever happened, they would be basically stripping themselves down to their most essential functions and securities in order to invest into it, amplifying their connection through the bonus credit score system and all of the advantages David would have done in order to encourage them to have made those trades in the economic treaty with the Russians. At which point you have the active protection against the collapse, which is inevitable, which just means when it does fracture, it's stable. So the contract schedule, as long as the trade routes are stabilized, uh, at least have to have been that finalized contract schedule, which then, after the market has been established, asserts J. Sekulo's war's necessary force in order to win to have acquired market price. They have to do necessary force in order to win, which means they have to beat the market in order to acquire their goals, or they become excessive. And thus, they defeating that exceed the market and then acquire their objectives, which requires them to have not tampered with that market. Or they're engaged in communism and are actively creating debts for themselves and going in the opposite direction of acquiring their goals. So, by definition, that market has to be exceeded, which cannot be co-signed until David enters the market. At which point they have to wait for David to be able to have the capacity to have an educated response to make those answers, which means he's fully supplied by advisors, which he would have anyways, who would actively be co-signing and ensuring all of these additional contracts. So by definition, this is where the air security for 9/11 comes in. This is the establishment of his locations throughout the entire contract, which is going to include the contracts in Salem for the projected advancements of the new companies, which would have actively had to have been attached. Uh, I'm not sure if the market had Next in it already or if it would have been a new one, but that and Pixar and the rest of it would have had to have been generated as the pretext of the minimum functions, such as the National News Corporation and the political social media, which would have been started to generate from his education concerning the studies of those issues, and maintaining those notes would be able to be copied and pasted onto the internet whenever that would be generated, facilitating the basic structure of political negotiations and debates as the mechanism of organizing all of it in the D&D type of arrangement would have actively been accelerating the political conversation to advance mutual interest in settling diplomatic agreements. So the free market assumes that Jeffrey Sachs and George Soros, who were plotting the collapse of the Soviet Union's economy once they took down the Iron Curtain, would have also included David's insurance, which they would have had as the treaty, which is fully informed in the full diversity of the objectives, and thus one requires the tolerance of the other by definition. So these agreements exist and they collapse into each other, generating the stabilized market, which is actively demanding the resources from David in order to maintain the treaty properly, stabilizing the Soviet coalition and the long-term peace and stability of those functions. As the investment into nobility requires the exponential losses in favor of gaining the political influence and sway with the international negotiations. And while David does not have any power in order to make anyone do anything, by definition, the quantity of racism conducted against the targeted communities and abuses against the targeted communities, by definition, is how much they feel threatened. The more they feel threatened, the more they have to run to the network. And the more they run to the network, the more they have to invest into the network interests. And so the network actively facilitates their investments accelerated into its interests, this at least the same amount as the white nationalists are racist against them in the wizard communism. And that requires them to actively engage in their own due diligence concerning the reparations or the claim against the crimes against them, which is an entire market which is too much for any one person to know or understand without it being organized into records and processed into its own series of orders. So by definition, they have to do all of the work for that claim before it can be compared to the money covering it as a debt and leveraged as an incentive for the acceleration of the market. So these are key pieces of information that they have to finish before they can be taken seriously, and thus before David can be taken seriously concerning the actual free market numbers. And and that materializes into David being born sovereign. And thus, being born sovereign, his embassies and consulates are his sovereign jurisdiction outside of outside rules, which they have to abide by. So, by definition, when they send their resources to him, they, such as the rape culture, sending their women in order to acquire strategic relationships, such as in David's absence to the wizard communists, they would have to capture specific markets in order to corner them, such as their cornering of brokerages, such as their cornering of housing, such as their cornering of farming, such as their cornering of the black market, such as weed and many of the others, which actively have to be consolidated in order to normalize their political power as a cohesive unit, such as the CIA's control over the cartels, which actively distributes these functions. And once they put the person into the isolated location, and then told to acquire the mission, then the only way that they could be allowed to become comfortable is to comply with the thing, and thus it's an active rape contract by permit in order to advance their objectives, including the sales and distribution to their markets. So the people who purchase the permit actively have access to the thing, and then the person that they bought is actively accelerated in the direction, such as the position with the, I think it was the Swedes and the English, who actively are using birth certificates as stocks to control bodies, which is a direct violation of the right of the person, their papers, and their effects to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, by definition, this is a criminal slave market. But the fact that the wizard communist white nationalist doesn't really mean that they would be too interested in that function, at which point separating the two, you go back into the free market where they actively have to acquire David's permission. So they would actively be accelerating the ones that they've actively been pushing him to in order to defame him and then coerce him away from for defamation, would have actively been sent to him, needing to acquire his permission for their objectives. So by definition, this assertion means that that is whatever they would normally be saying for their other objectives would have to be done with David. And thus, the assumption is that David inside the caravan would actively be separated from his birth family in favor of acquiring the contract schedule, as he's fully devoted to himself and to his treaties, such as national security, which actively has the assertion that he would have been nursing with their wet nurses since he was at least 7, I believe is what they said, which actively advance into premature sexuality as that requires his permission. So their one-shot gimmick is sexuality. So by definition, that has to be the thing. So that's basically the function, and that would continue until their racism becomes too excessive for them to be able to tolerate them paying the market price and being able to settle at acquiring their mission legitimately by those that they have material malice and contempt for, being able to have those benefits. So, by definition, the girls who are getting revenge as the exes wouldn't have wanted to separate with David, and David wouldn't have separated with them. They would have been told to separate because the racists wouldn't have been able to stomach the relationship anymore, and then their intolerance uh, becoming insatiable means that they would have actively pulled them apart from the exact thing that they were ordered to do, which I don't really have good numbers or timelines for, but by definition, it's directly connected to how much they invested into the defamation, is their retaliation from racism of their insatiable opposition to the function of those interracial relationships, which actively is reinforced by the rest of the market of those who would have been able to, but the permits not able to have those permits anymore because it was sent to the Patriarchy instead, which means it's no longer available for the market, which means they're actively disrupted, which means they're actively retaliating, which means their community of rapists are actively retaliating, and thus you have the level of intolerance by the collective movement becoming excessive to them being able to accomplish the mission as an entire collective society of white nationalist lynch mobs, as they were hyper weird about the fact when David was an infant that they believed that his hyper masculinity ruined the entire thing because his masculinity wouldn't fail before the racism failed. So they're the ones who would have broken contract because of their core nature, and they actively affirmed that they believed that he would grow up to be 6'3" with a 6-inch dick, which complements with the hypermasculinity generates the fact that if they were going to have sex with him until he broke, then by definition they have to have the most sex with him so that he gives up sex with the others in the group or with the other relationships. And so his sexuality being reduced on the other ones means they were spent on that one, means they have to fully invest into sex um, in those locations in order to break down the rest of the structure. So if he's too masculine for that, then by definition, they're just having the most amount of sex possible with him. And it's not breaking down, which means they give up by the racism before them. Now, the assertion between that and whether or not they're actually wanting to have sex with him, such as falling in love with him, by definition, any sign that he wasn't able to keep up would actively increase the quantity of foreplay so that he would be able to sustain the other relationships, which would allow them to be satisfied and would allow the other relationships to remain satisfied as well, which generates the pretense of what they actually believe. But the question is, if they believe that, then by definition, they can't tell the racists that they've fallen in love, so they have to just say that it's just pure dick sex. And since it's just pure dick sex is the story that they have to tell by definition, the suspicion that they're falling in love has to actively be opposed. And so you just have the assumption of that, which generates the natural reactions, which stabilizes. So if they are in love with him, they're actively going to have the most amount of sex with them. And if they're not in love with them, they have to have the most sex with them, which generates the pretense to being able to tell the narrative, which generates the assertion that by definition, that's what they have to tell everyone else who are ordering them into that position, normalizing their ability to have convinced the collective group concerning the warrants on how to behave according to the reaction and adapt to the market. Because again, while they're trying to get his permission, they can't be subversive, so they can't try and sabotage his relationships as long as they need his permission. So by definition, Jay's problem is the fact that David is projected to be attracted to adults the entire time, and they're the only ones that could provide them. By definition, that generates them cornering the market with the best products, having capped and defeated the market, so they're winning until they give up on the mission, which leads to their other missions, such as beating the free market and the rest of the economic exchanges, which actively provides him the most money concerning his businesses. Now, while his wages are sustained at 25.6 million an hour, that's with from his company by definition, which is actively acquiring exponentially more in order to acquire those contracts. So the company itself getting better and better contracts is actively generating its higher resources for those arrangements, which is actively reinvesting into the best business of the network interests. As the title for the business of the Legend of David Brokerage Company generates the additional resources separated to David's private accounts, which are traded separately, which is a weird thing because I believe that they think that the company is itself David's birth certificate, which means by definition David would have been arranged back in the 1700s or something. At which point they think that from that arrangement that he would have been owning slaves personally, which is the original market. So their claim that they don't want to be slaves or wouldn't have wanted to be slaves means by definition that they would have had to have been David's slaves working under those contracts from the insurance network, generating those advantages, which is just redirecting the wages and advantages back into the network itself, which actively has to cover for it and actively not trigger the lynch mobs from the white nationalists who would have retaliated against the assertion of them becoming valuable, such as defending themselves from the things that would make them upset. So, by definition, they would have had to have invested in their women's, the black women's education instead of the white um, men and women versus the black men who would have actively demonstrating that they're valuable would have actively triggered the racists. So those exchanges would have actively amplified their investment back into the network, which would have been the plantations, which would have actively been expanding and purchasing and distributing more slaves by resale. So the purchase of slaves from other slave owners into the plantations. And as they expand to the various locations, which the plantations would then upgrade into the School of Hard Knocks by definition, because you need to have the faculties for the education capable of providing the services, which would have actively had to have been maintained. So while that whole arrangement, the customs would settle at each specific location as a specific retaliation or reaction and settlement with the threat surrounding them. So the racists are actively trying to slander David by trying to say that, well, David's forefathers wouldn't have had slaves by definition. They thought he would have slaves, which they're trying to make it look like that would make him a bad person. So these advancements actively assume that the insurance with the other nations who are getting insured includes those nations who've gotten into conflicts with the United States, would have actively had to have had treaties with David by definition according to the insurance market, which generates the position for him to have managed the function of foreign aid with many of them or most of them based upon whatever the market was, but it would have to have actively accelerated in beating the market by those who have to win. So, by definition, as many of them as physically possible, such as the far as the resources could be stretched, would have actively had to been the satisfaction of that number, such as the investment into Japan after it lost in World War II, which would have actively hyper accelerated the position of it being David's treaty with Japan instead of McCarthy's plan, which would have actively generated the position to try and get them to have tensions against David for owning Japan as a retaliation, so that the white nationalists who actually want to kill them because they're still racist against them for the Second World War or, intergenerationally racist against them because white nationalism generates the position of them actively being chased into those who are trying to hurt them away from those who are actively trying to stabilize them in the highest security market. So that being assumed actively creates the problem because their women were projected to have lost the long-term relationship to the Slavic coalition, which would have actively sent um, its women who they thought were going to win by investing into them to David. By definition, once the Iron Curtain went down and the trade started, they would have had to have made their projections, which they had already settled on what they believed from the military intelligence to have sent to him on the projection of whose parents were attractive according to their breeding algorithms and star signs and the rest of that jam. So basically, astrology is essential to understand most of their calculations according to their witchcraft for the reinforcement of these mechanisms of intelligence from the military. So whatever that would have said by definition is what they would have had to have actively invested into because that's what they believe in. So if they thought that they would have lost, then that would have made them angry. Being able to have endured the relationships until they didn't means they would have given up. But they investing into the short-term, limited thinking of accomplishing their mission would have actively engaged in the retaliations, which generated their plot to sabotage Ukraine by prompting Russia to invade it. Uh, a long time ahead of time, which would have been impossible with David's original order from the insurance treaty, from their economic treaty with David and the Russians, which would have actively stopped that from being possible, as NATO's expansion would have not existed under those original protections because of David's original influence in those positions, actively engaging in the stability and confidence necessary for peaceful negotiations in the full diversity of perspective. So, by definition, they believe that they would have lost that, which is them not winning the market, which is them actively conceding to those positions, which is actively replaced by the other treaties, which means they believe that they're starting to fall behind on being able to beat the market, and they're no longer able to keep up, which is generating their lack of confidence of being able to buy off the market, which would have made them more anxious, which would have made them invest more heavily into sex, which would have taken up more of David's time, exponentially more of his resources, reducing his opportunities in the function of working and school and the rest of it, because they need to catch up, they need to stabilize their position, they need to assert their place in the market, they need to claim their advances. And the more they invest into sex, the less they can invest into markets, the less they invest into earning money, the less money they're making. And so you understand the problem of their downward spiral. So by definition, David has to acquire more high-level experts and PhDs in order to catch up for David not being able to do the work himself. And so the contracts are actively distributed higher amongst that system, which is not actively advancing the interest of the Confederacy, because the Confederates aren't the ones getting the contracts. David's market is getting the contracts. And so by definition, they're people aren't winning, taking over those missions. And so it's actively reinforcing the stability on David's side against them, while they're merely having to facilitate the existence of the contract. They aren't actually getting a degrading into the function, they're just increasing the quantity of contracts that he has, and they're increasing his human decency by the quality of the relationships they're drowning him in. So, by definition, in the version where communists are in control, the amount that they have to stay away from David is the amount that they would have had to have been drawn to David according to the free market of them acquiring their mission by purchase of the mission. And thus, the more they would have fallen in love with him, thus, the more it would have had to have been separated with him. So, their crimes that they committed against him, such as their attempts to humiliate him, is actively reinforcing their reaction to their own numbers of being insatiably insane and violent against it, as a direct calculation through algebra, which generates the actual numbers of their belief based upon their abuse, signals the rest of the calculation. Thus, the more they would have intimidated everyone into place, thus, the more revenge they would have actively had to seed into the girls' hearts, thus, the more insatiably insane they would have been towards David, thus, the less they could treat him like a person. So, the more they're unable to act like a stable, functioning person around David when he's not being specifically sabotaged as the excuse, would have actively reinforced the actual assumed numbers, including their negotiation with the terrorists sabotaging the exchange to actively reaffirm David's suppression and status and sex appeal, which generates their capacity to uh, be able to sustain themselves. So, like when you break up with someone, by definition, like you take their pictures, you cut them out, and you doodle on them. You make them look uglier, you give them horns, you give them fangs, you make them look worse. By definition, hiring the terrorists to suppress and make David look worse is a direct reaction to the amount that they calculated they would have been emotionally attached to him, which is actively being retaliated in their block market exchanges, which is actively reaffirming their abusers' um, objectives. So, by definition, those who wanted them to not be together more than they do are the ones that they're serving by collaborating with this objective, which they would have actively had to reaffirm, as they could not tell them that they were in love with David by definition because of the racism which is separating them. So, by definition, that whole circle jerk is an arrangement of the market which generates the basic numbers for the algebra, which generates the actual retail value of the relationship that they are emotionally attached to and the quantity of emotions that they've attached to. So they cannot, by definition, treat him like a person and be normal and stuff, because that would actively be subverted in their overarching objectives, such as not signaling to the racists that they aren't with them anymore, from the confidence that David's sexuality would have converted them to the Americans and the free market, away from the wizard communist white national. This is actively reaffirmed by the policies such as Lindsey Graham's reaffirmation of the Confederacy policies, which are advancing the use of war against American civilians for any reason, including race, which means by definition they're bringing back the white nationalist lynch mob by the KKK wizard communist contracts, which generates the alteration to the market, which generates the facilitation of them investing into wizard communism from their centrally planned economy for the white nationalist extortion. So these Confederate policies actively accelerate, specifically targeted against individuals and people and races and groups, which immediately is disbarred by constitutional law, such as the position of the FBI creating protections of sources and methods which actively have already been attached to surveillance treaties with other nations. So, by definition, the ones that they claim that they're trying to stop from getting it are the ones who already have it by the arrangement of treaties. So, by definition, they don't actually have an argument. It's just specifically designed to defeat David specifically. And thus, it's criminal racism and disqualified at every level. And so, by definition, the common use of weapons, the standard use of weapons, which are used against the civilians or used by civilians, has to actively be maintained. So, by definition, having protected equipment that isn't used by civilians, which is used on civilians, is an exceeding of the limitation of that function, at which point the use of those secrets is a subversion of the constitutional position of SCOTUS's opinion on the Second Amendment, which is disqualifying the policy again and many other ways. So you understand that their investment to this function actively generates the position that David, such as with the Bolivian War, would have actively been encouraged to engage in more and more risks. And since he would have actively had the treaty with the Russians, he would have actively had security to have acquired the resources and delivery of the function, which was assumed to have ended the war with fewer casualties, as David would have accomplished the specific missions according to his strategies and the assertion of his claim of territory, such as his state, embassy, and the rest of it in the settlement, as they would have been forced by overwhelming force in order to sign the peace settlement. So, since they can't break David in the market because of his services are too excessive to their capacity to provide problems legally, and since his sexuality is beyond their ability to satisfy, they have to actively put him in danger by hiring him into the intelligence oversight highest level general position, which actively has to be used to put him into combat to maximize the potential of him dying as a child, as their maximum investment into that function means, by definition, he has to be put in danger in a way that he can't defeat, which they assumed he was going to be defeated. Since by definition he isn't going to lose, then by definition they can't kill him in war, so by definition they had to forfeit this position. But they have to invest in putting him in danger as a small child, as this is his least capabilities of control of faculties, maximizing the amount of threat that he would have been in. But the problem is that his investments would have actively enforced into the security function, which would have actively been used in the war, which would have actively reassured his value. So at the entry level, at his most vulnerable state, by definition, he's still more powerful than any threat that they can hire, which actively reaffirms their original contract schedule, which would have included David having to have had been facilitated the creation of the Malibu campus for the School of Hard Knocks, which would have been built in order to have gained David's approval by them beating the market under the contract for the influence, which would have actively guaranteed David's location inside of California under those arrangements, under his security mechanism, under his security mechanisms, which would have included his armor, such as hazmat suits, which would have actively protected him from being poisoned, which he would have suspected from them and would have already countered from the insurance function of the standard policies of the PhD women who have been abused historically, and thus actively taught themselves how to protect themselves from the threats, such as the dropping of poison on them from the sky, which is actively designed to get them sick, or poisoning the fruits, and all of these mechanisms. So the military actively doing fake experiments in order to hurt them by their wizard abuse and the loyalty and worship and service of the devils actively reinforces itself into the counterfunction of the market protecting itself from the abuses, such as the infection of the military by the white nationalists after World War II, which would have actively engaged in the function of standardizing the engagement of promotions in the system into a political structure away from its pure capability. So promotion by ability would have been ignored in favor of promotion by politics, which actively reinforces the threats as they would have exponentially increased the problem from those arrangements, which would have been historically recorded and countered by those trying to protect themselves from those specific threats, from being poisoned without their knowledge or consent. So the protection against being poisoned against the knowledge and consent by the military or the white nationalist military of its unprofessional forces would have actively been reinforced into its spy versus spy mentality. But having to beat the market, and David in California actively assumes the position that David is actively making himself essential to their government. So the legal Republic of California, before the overthrow by the white nationalists, is primarily supported into David's political party, which they're trying to remove by the targeting of the political targeting in order to remove him for the voter roll, in order to subsequently change the votes through voter fraud, which is an attack of war against the rule of law and the ability to form a republic, which is a war against the legal government by the white nationalists, who the American military has to do national security and use lethal retaliation against them in the security of the government, which is being subverted by the voter fraud, as David would have taken the primary mechanism of the locations which are being subverted and being compromised against him specifically to target him specifically by subjugating him to foreign jurisdictions such as California, Oregon, and Washington and New York, which would have actively had his investments which means by definition, the more they would have threatened him, the more he would have had to have taken over their government legally. So the more he has to have the market in those states, which they can't bar, which by definition actively encourages his investments in those locations in the promotion of its political sway, which generates his power brokering capabilities beyond his political party, which would have generated his control over the system, which is the abject throwing out of the white nationalists from power legally. So Jay's Civil War isn't California versus the other states. It's the white nationalists versus the Republic of California, which is David Bowles. David is the state of California. David is the Republic of California. Since David is the Republic of California, it can't be used against itself. So when it says the state versus, it doesn't say anything according to their mission. It says the state versus Jay's terrorists, which generates the position of Lindsey Graham's advancement of the Confederate lynch mobs, of advancing the white nationalist terrorist organizations through the KKK contracts, generating these terrorist subversions as an insurrection, as an enemy of the United States, as guilty of treason, sedition, and high crimes, as they are blocking the legal functions of the government by these restraints which are obstructing the legal function of the government, which is their enemy, the United States Constitutional Republic, is their enemy of war. That is their enemy. That is what they are fighting against. That is what their military campaign against the civilians is designed to accomplish, the dismantlement of the legal government over the jurisdictions with authority. The replacement of authority with power by terrorism is their entire fucking gimmick. This would have evolved into David's position of using all of his investments as intelligence oversight to engage in the power brokering funding from the military. So everything that he's doing in the military is its own series of secret accounts which are generating investments into the traps and subversions of the government being investigated, or the double agents or spies, etc., being investigated, or whatever Congress is telling David to do in order to do national security from those positions is actively being funded by the military accounts, such as his function as the aristocracy, which is his vetting of the Senate. So no one in the Senate is actually the Senate without David's permission, because the law before their obstructions and changes says that the aristocracy, which is David Bowles, is the only one to determine the election of the Senate, which gives David control over the super veto, which is the Senate's affirmation or rejection of the president's veto. So whenever David would have negotiated a veto with the president who would have been elected illegally, it would have been a permanent answer, at which point any policy that he would have been receiving from the reports, such as the FBI, saying is an illegal policy or disbarred for some reason or disqualified, such as the position of Congress's policy to be able to take loans out of Social Security, which is specifically disbarred by law. Their rejection of that, receiving the super veto from David, would be an example of it being impossible to have accomplished those missions, which would have prevented them from destabilizing Social Security or the United States interests by the Confederate infection. So the reaffirmation of these subjects include the position of the biblical position of David of the Bible, which generates the things that they would have actively been trying to use for their other manipulations, which would have actively engaged in the political subcontext, which would have been used for those negotiations, such as their investment into David's School of Hard Knocks music functions, which means by definition he would have had the highest grade talent possible concerning the instrument specifically focused on, such as the pretext of uh, the rest of the entertainment functions for all of the other videos and so on, which would have allowed David to have done the specific training and amplifying of contracts for those who are trying to make it big off of those positions, which requires David to have been able to write and demonstrate songs for them to be able to copy, along with all of the other staff reaffirming these positions, allowing them to have the writers off screen so that they can actively be amplified with better materials on stage, which would have actively been reinforced to the original contract schedule assumption of David's involvement into the entertainment industry, such as their assumption of his dealings with Britney Spears and NSYNC and the rest of them, which would have actively had to have been involved in beating the market, so by definition, they are original associates under the obstructed market, which would have stopped Brittany's conservatorship because David would have had all of the power in the exchange, and anyone who would have tried to have done it from her family or others would have had zero influence, as no one who wants that to happen, which are Confederates, and the conservatorship as an extension of slavery without cause is a criminal act, is an exclusive Confederate objective, could not be challenged by them because the Confederates are the ones who need David's permission. So that would make her permanently secured from those subversions, including the surveillance terrorism of the KKK, using the poisoning without knowledge or consent, which generates the false assertion of insanity, which would have justified the foundation of the conservatorship slavery. So you understand exactly how much JC would have been threatening everyone. So Justin Timberlake saying in his songs that he's going to bring sexy back is actively going to make the most waves possible, as that is the biggest threat he could ever make to anyone from their side whatsoever. The existence of bringing back sexy would be catastrophic to their entire rape culture and thus establish the free market, which would have irritated every single fiber of the white nationalists in their collective society. JT aside, these things would have actively reaffirmed David's attractiveness according to the sexual market value, which would have actively generated the reinforcement of the market trying to seek his sexual attention, which would have actively been competing and thus amplified by the existence of those who are already arranged in those locations, which actively generates additional contests, which actively generates various threats against their cornering of the market, at which point eventually something's got to break, especially after David becomes an adult and it's no longer illegal for the rest of the market to provide him adults, and thus Jay's white nationalists would no longer have the cornered market. Now, I'm not really sure what the treaty with Canada would have had to have been by definition, but I think that they would have had to have made a treaty because David needs to be able to make his international trade routes, which has to go through Canada, which would have actively generated locations where he would have had to have deposited and exchanged his trades, especially if he was going to make a treaty with this former Soviet Union, which generates the position of being able to travel through Alaska, which requires him to actively have those connections in Canada from the trade routes of being able to travel through trucks, uh, which on both ends, the shortest distance from the sea disconnected to the shore has to go from Alaska or on the other side, but both ways he's actively traveling through Canada, which would make it easier for him to actively have truck routes exchanging. So the economic treaties with them wouldn't be that too much of a stretch to assume. in order to make those exchanges to the ports, which would have been the easiest way for him to have made those long-term exchanges, maximizing the shortest distance of open water. So I'm not really sure, but they would have had to have been essential to the trade route. So if America's Hat can send the obstructed records concerning what those agreements are and the market specifically attached to it, which is being obstructed with the most accurate numbers possible, then that would be very much so appreciated. So, by definition, removing the things that have the most influence over certain things actively changes the substantive results by changing enough of the definition that it becomes a different definition entirely to the original word, which generates the leverage and distributions of those policies which normalize the position, such as the signing and co-signing of each treaty and agreement, such as the United States with the opposition to war crimes policies from international pacts, which, by definition, the co signing of human rights from those agreements would have actively been negotiated by David's advanced, highly educated, accelerated facilitation of the faculties essential to the settlement of those arrangements. And if they are going to make those arrangements, by definition, they would have had to have had their treaty with David in order to have gained the faculties with those arrangements, consolidating the larger international agreement, normalizing the status quo function of the general society, such as the ability to arrest war criminals, uh, who have infiltrated the United States, such as the white nationalists who are in active rebellion to the government. The nations that were scheduled to be invaded by the white nationalists using the United States military, such as in the Middle East, would have actively needed to have contracted through David to have stopped those conflicts, generating a list of treaties which were essential to their security, which they would have known about, and he would have informed of them, as that list had existed before David was born. So, by definition, the intelligence oversight would have known about it and would have already informed them, including the mechanism on how uh, to stop the threat from being realized from the predetermined bigoted answer of the guaranteed invasion for the extortions. So each and every one of those nations would, by definition, have been informed ahead of time, and each and every one of them would have had to have made their treaties with David specifically in order to have protected themselves, stopping those wars in the Middle East and others, which actively reinforces the list of the economic treaty lists for David's network, citing the original value of the market, which has to have included them. By definition, their value, which would have actively intertwined that with foreign aid, which would have been conducted through David's treaty, if it would have existed at all, which actively reinforces the mechanism of his insurance market throughout the nations, generating the total potential value of him in his services to other peoples around the world.